Hello and welcome. This recording is meant to help you understand the basics of psychology, which will reinforce your overall understanding. So this is an extra resource to help you. And our focus today is going to be on the theoretical perspectives. So and you're going to have to understand those. And the better you understand those, the better you're going to understand overall psychology and really where they came from and how psychology came about and why they're always changing. So that's the biggest thing, in understanding why they changed and how they changed. So and then at the end, I'm going to give you a cheat sheet to help you as well. So let's get started. I am going to take my camera off so that I can don't distract at all. So when psychology was first established as a science, separate from philosophy, the debate over how to explain human behavior and analyze the mind began. That's when it all began. The first two psychological theories to emerge during this time were structuralism and functionalism. I'm going to use these first two theories as examples of how the rest have evolved. While neither of these theories exist today, both made important contributions to the development of modern psychology, which this helps us understand. It helps the thinking, like how did this all come about? All of this is the same for all of these perspectives that we're going to talk about today. So this is just kind of like, it's just an example, structuralism and functionalism. So despite the wide range of topics within the discipline of psychology, they still all share that common root in the systematic study of the mind and behavior. So really, they all still have those roots, even though they're looking at something different, or they're looking at another reason or why this could be happening. The root is still the same. It's all about that systematic study and understanding how psychology came about, and these first thoughts or viewpoints of human behavior will help you understand why there are so many different viewpoints as well, and how they are all intertwined still, because they're still all intertwined together and they still all work together, which we are discovering with the nature and nurture. With epigenetics coming along, you can see how these theories continue to evolve when new information comes about. So structuralism emerged as the first school of thought, and some of the ideas associated with structuralist school were advocated by the founder of the first experimental psychology lab, William Wundt. And that you will read a little bit about him in the book when you start doing your readings, and in IntelliBath we'll discuss it as well. And then in response to the structuralism, now this is the key, because once somebody comes up with an idea, somebody's going to come with a response. You know that it's either going to complement it or it's going to be completely different. Now, in response to this structuralism, an American perspective known as functionalism emerged from thinkers such as Charles Darwin and William James. It has to do with the functions of the mind and the brain, which we're going to talk about even more. So here's a quick video that's going to help you kind of see where psychology has started and where we're kind of ended up and how it's kind of gotten there.
A lot of people think that psychology started with this guy, Sigmund Freud, but that's just wrong. So let's begin at the beginning. Where did psychology come from? The first inklings of psychology came out of philosophy. So let's go back to its heyday, back in ancient Greece. Socrates developed the dialectic method, which was a way of breaking down really big questions into smaller and smaller questions in a way to pursue some sort of truth. It's a huge basis for the scientific method today. Plato, Socrates' student, said humans have a psyche, which is Greek for soul. He said that the psyche was comprised of three different parts: reason, emotion, and desire, or logos, thymos, and eros. Plato's student, Aristotle, also explored the psyche or soul, but he wanted to know what made humans different from plants or animals. He concluded that humans have intellect, but he didn't mean intellect in the modern sense, as in solving problems or being smart, but more like what today we'd call consciousness. At the same time as these philosophers doing their thing, the Greek physician Hippocrates was studying individuals with mental illness, and he concluded that these disorders resulted from physical issues with the body, rather than possession, curses, or other supernatural causes. Over in China, Buddhist and Confucian teachings talked about the differences between physical and mental realities. This was an early concept of dualism, but it didn't get expanded beyond that. They also thought that mental disorders were an imbalance of the mind with the body. In the 1st century AD, Galen, a Greek physician, philosopher, and jack of all trades type, made some incredible discoveries. Through dissection of human bodies, he found that the brain and nervous system are connected to the muscles, and that's how they're controlled. He also hypothesized that the brain was the source of emotions and thoughts, and even suggested that talk therapy for psychological problems would be a good thing. I mean, talk about a guy ahead of his time. Ahead of his time. Ahmed ibn Sal al-Balkhi, a Muslim Persian scientist, developed the idea of mental health in the 9th century. He said that sickness in the mind could affect the body and vice versa. He also seemed to have developed the first definition of depression, which is pretty amazing. In the 13th century, the Polish theologian and scientist Witello wrote a surprisingly accurate concept of the subconscious. It's pretty much in line with our modern idea of the subconscious today. In the 17th century, René Descartes said, "Cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am. It's a simple phrase, but it showed the importance of cognition on the human experience. In an unplanned left turn away from science, Franz Joseph Gall and Johann Gaspar Spurzheim developed phrenology, a pseudoscience that says that different parts of the brain corresponded to different mental traits, such as hope, love, spirituality, greed, and a whole lot of other stuff. Phrenologists thought that they could read a person's skull to detect the sizes of these brain parts and diagnose issues. That was not true. Whoops, all right, back on track. The actual term psychology became popular in the 18th century when philosopher Christian Wolff wrote 2 books, Empirical Psychology and Rational Psychology. However, psychology was still considered part of philosophy, and it wasn't its own thing. And for a while there, people thought that maybe it would never become its own thing, including Immanuel Kant. He never thought that it would be a proper natural science because its phenomena could not be quantified, or at least not back then. Dang Kant. I can't believe he said that. However, the 19th century saw a burst of interest and new discoveries that marked the beginning of psychology as its own scientific discipline. This included Paul Broca and Carl Wernicke identifying areas of the brain responsible for language functions. This led way for Wilhelm Wundt, who started the first experimental psychology lab, the first university department of psychology, and the first professional journal dedicated to psychology in 1874 in Zurich, Germany. A year later, William James, an American physician, brought psychology to the US and offered the first psychology course at Harvard. More than anyone else, William James is responsible for the modern field of psychology. He viewed psychology as a triad, or a triangle, or a triforce, consisting of 3 parts: the clinical practice, laboratory research, and theoretical formulations. And finally, we get to Freud. In Vienna, Austria in 1890, Sigmund Freud developed psychoanalysis and starts using it on everybody. This new therapy made waves and spread quickly through Austria, Germany, France, Britain, and even America. The American Psychological Association, or APA, which is still running today, was founded soon after in 1892. But psychology was still facing an identity crisis. Traditionalists wanted to focus on introspection and human consciousness. But newcomers like behaviorist John B. Watson wanted psychology to reject the study of consciousness and only study behavior. In the end, both sides won. Today, psychology is defined as the study of mind and behavior. And that is how psychology was born. Today, psychology is a multifaceted, diverse discipline that encompasses everything from animal research to clinical therapy. After thousands of years of study, we're still trying to understand the human mind. Modern psychology is only a little over 100 years old, so who knows what else we'll discover in the next 100. Thanks for watching this episode.
Okay, so that gives you kind of an example of and a visual of really how psychology has came about. And it also talks about how it's the theories have evolved. This one didn't
A
go
lot
into
of people think
this did not go into the theories specifically, but I am going to do that. So and I start he talked a little bit about really about that Wernicke, and really finding those parts of the brain that actually are tied to our behavior. So they didn't know this before. And the reason I bring up Phineas Gage first, in 1848, Phineas Gage suffered brain damage when an iron pole pierced his brain. His personality was changed, but his intellect remained intact. This suggested that an area of the brain plays a huge role in personality, because when this happened to Phineas Gage, and this is an image of him and after it had healed, and then you can see the bar going straight through and what part of the brain that it went through, and you can see the future, the technology, how it showed how it went through. Now, it was a huge discovery. And if you ever have a chance to read the book, it's small and it's a good read. And it really, when you think about the times, I mean, they didn't even know what pus was. They didn't know that it was white blood cells. They didn't know about infection, anything like this. And when you're looking at some of the images of when they were actually studying Phineas Gage after this had happened, they're all dressed in normal clothes. Doctors are studying him and touching him without gloves and washing their hands, none of that. So it's pretty surprising that he even survived, but he did. But the first thing that I want you to know is that when before this happened, his character, he was described as a kind, caring human being and a fabulous leader, very, very logical, very intellect. He really was a very, very good man. He had really strong character. Well, now when this happened afterwards, his personality drastically changed. He became belligerent. He could no longer work with like human beings. He ended up leading a horse wagon that delivered things, and he had better relationships with the animals than he could with human beings afterwards. And it was just crazy. But this is when they first discovered, and back then the only time that they could, because they didn't have the technology that we have now, the only thing that early time that they could actually discover what the brain did for us is when it was damaged. and then they studied it. So the next, in 1859, Charles Darwin published he published on the origin of species, detailing his view of evolution and expanding on the theory of survival of the fittest, which he was very well known, and we still discuss a lot of his things as well. And then after him came in 1861, which the video you saw in the video, that came the Broca area. So Paul Broca discovered an area in the left frontal lobe that plays a key role in language development. First to discover the different functions are assigned to different brain parts. So again, they're starting to discover even more with more damage to the brain. And then he also studied brains of dead people. So you got to think that's all he could get was the dead people. But also he was able to correlate these dead brains with their known traits to their brain anatomy, and then look for those patterns. And then remember, when you're looking at these theories, you always want to know where they got their information. Where's that evidence? What is the evidence? That's the critical thinking component of all of this. And then he kind of creepy, but he saved hundreds of human brains in jars. But look at what we got out of it. So pretty cool. So 1874, Cardinal Wernicke published his work on the frontal lobe, detailing that damage to a specific area damages the ability to understand or produce the language. So that again, damaged areas of the brain, and they're starting to discover that the brain actually does more than just be gray matter. He also related nerve disease to specific areas of the brain. He discovered structure in the left lobe, controls language comprehension, which again, we call Wernicke's area. And then another huge thing that he did was Wernicke's aphasia. This is where we speak in garbled sentences and poor speech comprehension. So pretty fascinating. And again, theories evolving constantly. Now, as the video discussed, in 1879, William Wundt and the first psychological lab. So this is huge for psychology in general, because this really brings us into the science. And then rather than being tied to the other disciplines. So that a lot of times they call him the father of psychology. So first laboratory intended exclusively for psychological research. And here's that one of the original theories, the structuralists thought. And he maintained that the elements of experience were sensations and feelings. He maintained your experience is partly under your voluntary control. You can shift your attention from one element to another and get a different experience. That's the biggest, that's the foundation of structuralists. To test his ideas about experience, he asked his subjects to introspect. Again, at the beginning, it was all about introspecting and really finding out how we tick on the inside, but you had to talk to to the clients in order to find this out. So introspect is to look within oneself. And then 1886, Sigmund Freud comes along, and he was huge. And part of why he was a huge contributor to the science of psychology was because he was bold and said things that were not acceptable back then. And you got to kind of figure, back in the 1800s, they didn't talk about sex and aggression. And they sure as heck didn't want to think that they had any of those urges or drives, and we all do. And we got to own it. So he did have something there. So he did contribute a ton. And we still take kind of his, a lot of his thinking, because he thought of nurture and nature, because the instincts are in us to lean towards that instant gratification, which is where he thought it had to do with id, the id, ego, and superego. But again, those were unconscious realms that we couldn't see. So you want to keep that in mind. However, some of the things that he contributed with were huge. He theorized that the unconscious thought gets repressed. And we all know this too, because we do repress a lot of our unconscious thoughts. Now, depending on how far it goes, and Freud, he was on coke his whole life. So he also really thought way out there. He also believed that all thoughts, emotions, and actions are determined. Nothing is accidental. Okay, they're all determined. And that has to do with your drives and what you learned from your parents. So that's the nurture side. He did both. He talked about both before we really got into the debate and the heated debate. And he created psychoanalysis, which we still use today. Now, this video, I'm not going to go over it. It is in our resources, but I highly suggest you watch it. It gives you a lot of information about Freud, and it's really interesting. And it's quick. And then the psychodynamic psychology, which is Freud started this. Psychodynamic psychology is an approach, again, theoretical perspective or a viewpoint, focusing on the role of unconscious thoughts, feelings, and memories. And again, it has to do with that id, ego, and superego. And we're going to talk a little bit about that at the end, closer to the end. So it's all about the unconscious processes. which may be revealed through talk therapy and dream analysis, which are all components of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. And we use these today. And all of this led to the clinical psychology, which is basically that applied stuff. Now, 1890, William James, which we talked about earlier, functionalist school of thought. So he really focused on how the mind functions to help us adapt to our environment or adapt to survive. So he had some major points as well, which really made sense. He was the first evolutionary psychologist. He was the founder or father of American psychology. And then he was first to write that textbook. So he had the first psychology textbook, and then James Lange theory of emotion, which we will be discussing and we use today. There's two other ones as well that are pretty strong, but James Lange theory is a huge one, and then which suggests that emotion occurs as a result of physiological reaction to the event. Okay, so there's a couple different ones, but that one still exists, and we still use it. And then, okay, so now we've talked about the psychoanalytic perspective. Now we're going into the behaviorist perspective. You kind of figure, and this will help you understand why they came about, because when they look at psychoanalytic, this came out in the psychodynamic theory. It's all about the unconscious and the inner workings of how we think and feel. Well, the behaviors are like, wait a minute, we should not be studying what we can't see. Okay, so that'll help you remember this. And Ivan Pavlov was one of the first ones. He published the first studies on classical conditioning. This is a huge one that you're going to have to know. It has to do with learning. Conditioning, replace the word conditioning with learning. So classical conditioning, his famous study had to do with the dog and teaching a dog to salivate to a bell. Okay. Now, naturally, dogs salivate to food. He associated the two and ended up teaching that dog how to salivate just when hearing a bell. And my association right here that I use is a classic dog, which is like Snoopy, and the classical conditioning. And that's how I remembered it. So he's most famous for this classical conditioning. You're going to have to know this. And then fueled a move in psychology toward the interest of observable behavior and away from the self-examination of inner ideas and experiences. Okay, so now we're moving into what you can see. And then John Watson in 1913, another behaviorist comes along and says, I think I can top this. Let's do another experiment. He's the founder of behaviorism for psychology. And his experiment was the Little Albert experiment. And Watson's work made psychology more objective and scientific. The behaviors overall made it more scientific. And this image shows kind of what he did. He associated a loud noise with a cute and cuddly little mouse. And when you put the two together, the loud noise is an automatic reaction or an instinctual reaction that makes the baby cry. But he associated these two. So then the baby started to cry when he just saw the mouse. And we'll go more into depth on how classical conditioning works as well. But then Jean Piaget comes along, and he's all about the cognitive perspective, really about how we think. So we've talked about, what our introspective, what our inner thoughts are, and what our what our inside id, ego, and ego are doing, and why are these driving our behaviors, stuff like that. We talked about the observable behaviors. How do we learn, and can we teach somebody and be able to watch and see if they actually learned from it? That's the behaviorist. And then the cognitive comes along and goes way more in depth on development and how does our cognitive development happen, which is thinking. So he published The Moral Judgment of Children. He is the leading theorist of cognitive development. And then I'm a little out of my animation's off, but he did the stages of cognitive development. So he had sensory meter stage, and then from that is from birth to age 2. And then you have the pre-operational stage, which starts when the child begins to learn to speak at age 2 and lasts up until the age 7. And then that concrete operational stage is from ages 7 to 11. And then formal operational stage is from age 11 to 16 and onward. So you can kind of see how he starts this whole idea of the development part when it comes to the thinking. Now, in 1942, the humanists start to emerge. Now, Carl Rogers, he published Counseling and Psychotherapy, which suggested the respect and non-judgmental, now this is a key, non-judgmental approach to therapy. So, in the other ones, psychodynamics is really looking at kind of like the ugly side of humans. It's kind of like some people think of it like this. And then the humanists are coming around and wanting to look at the positive side of psychology, of people. He had the foundation for effective mental health issues. Okay. Now, he was best known for his non-directive approach to treatment known as client-centered therapy. It's all about the client. And he emphasized conscious experience as the proper focus of psychology. So it's all about the conscious, not so much the unconscious, which is what psychodynamic did. He's talking about what's conscious and what and how did we come about. And then now there you still have, so the humanists enter into the picture, but then behaviorists are still working at it. And they're like, 1953, B.F. Skinner, best known for operant conditioning. Okay, remember operant, replace the word conditioning with learning, and that'll help you. Which are behaviors that came about because of what happens after the response. So if you do something, it's all about punishment and reward. So it's reinforcement is the reward. And then the punishment, like this picture is pretty good. This is his experiment. It's the Skinner box. And this is where a rat learns to obtain food by pressing a lever. So if you look at this picture, when the green light comes on, if he pushes that bar, he'll get food. But if the red light comes on and he pushes that bar, he's going to get shocked. So you see where he's been rewarded with reinforcers to keep up that behavior. So press the bar when it turns green. When it's, if you want to decrease that behavior, punishment came along, and punishment, that's going to stop the behavior. Okay, he's not going to push that bar when that red light comes on, hopefully. And it worked out. So, and he focused on responses to the learning. Okay, so then once the humanists came along, it starts on fire. So 1954, Abraham Maslow came along and founded the humanistic psychology and developed the hierarchy of needs, which you have all probably seen. Even the news talks about this part of psychology. So basically those human needs. So remember, the humanists are all about what makes a human human, and what are our needs and what are specific to us, and growth. Stuff like growth, self-actualization. We strive to be the best that we can be, and and this is kind of how we do it. And then 1963, the behaviors are still hanging in there, but this time they add that social learning theory. And some people call it social cognitive learning theory as well, because this is all about learning from another person. Really, like the Bobo doll was a famous experiment where they showed, the experiment was where an adult beat up a Bobo doll and then leaves the Bobo doll with a kid. And you see the kid do the same thing. He starts beating up the Bobo doll, but in other ones where they play and they're nice with the Bobo doll, the kid follows. That's that social learning. So it's still about learning. So it's still behaviorism, but they are evolving. So you can see how they have evolved and continue to evolve. So now this is the cheat sheet that I was talking about. And I'm going to go over this really quickly just to show you how to use it. So at the top, you have the 4 basics. Now remember, there's way more, which we've talked about, but this is specifically about those basics and how they came about and why. So, and then you'll understand why we have so many. And then you'll understand how even looking at a mental disorder, you'll see how the psychodynamic view is, the behavioral view of this disorder, and then the biological view as well. So, and any behavior, they all have their perspective of the behavior. Why is the behavior happening? Well, this is based on this perspective. So if a psychodynamic person is looking at a certain behavior, this chart will help you understand what they think the behavior or where the behavior came from or how it was developed. Okay, so across the top, psychodynamic, and then the person who's associated mostly with it right here, and then same with behavioral, the behavioral view, the humanistic view, and then the biological view. So we have Sigmund Freud, Skinner, and Rogers, and then Eisnick. So on the side, it talks about the sources of data. So like I have said before, you've always got to look for that evidence. Well, this is where you can see if you believe in what they have to say, because this is where they got their evidence. This is how they came about to say that this is the way people are, or what happens, or why it happens. Key motivational forces. What are those forces that they're saying develop us into who we are in whatever situation? And then the model of personality. This again shows you what their idea of how the personality developed. And then the view of development overall, it gives you specifics on what each one, how they develop. So when you're looking at somebody who has road rage, you can look in here and put and kind of be like, okay, road rage, according to the psychodynamic theory, emphasizes that fixation on progress through the psychosexual stages. Those psychosexual stages that Freud talked about, that's really, and it's not just, this is just on Freud. There's multiple psychoanalytic, psychodynamic theorists. So, and people to study as well. But the beginning started this way. And then those experiences in childhood leave lasting marks on adulthood. Okay, so that's what Freud and the psychodynamic people really thought had a lot to do with the development. And then for the behaviorists, look here, it says personality evolves gradually over lifespan, not in stages. Okay, Freud and psychodynamic is more stages. You saw where Piaget is in stages. Now, behaviorism, no, they do not do that. They think it has to do with responses followed by reinforcement that become more frequent. So the behavior starts to be encouraged and they learn to be who they are. Okay, and you can kind of see that's the view of development. Humanist, on the other hand, children who receive unconditional love have less need to be defensive. They're a little more confident in themselves. They develop more accurate self-congruent or congruent self-concepts. Conditional love fosters incongruence. Okay, now this is more of the positive psychology look. You're looking at the internal here, you're looking what you can view here and watch. And then here, you're looking at the good side of things that happen with those parents and what lasts and how this contributes. And then, of course, the biological emphasizes an unfolding of genetic blueprint with maturation inherited predisposition interact with learning experience. They still talked about it even back then because you still had like thresholds on whether or not that gene was going to be expressed as well. And what were you going to be more, so if you're going to interact with your learning experience, if you're already predisposed to be really like quiet, well, you may not go into those louder interaction places, and you're not going to learn from that. Okay, so that's how that works. So, and then it goes down into the roots of disorders, which you're going to want to know when we talk about disorders. And then importance of nature nurture, which one leans more to which. And then the importance of person factor versus situational factor. Now, this is where we haven't talked about this, but what is road rage more because of the person, or is it because of the situation that you're responding to, which is right here, situation, person. Okay, you can see how they're different, but this is a little cheat sheet to help you. So I hope that this helps you understand a little bit more of psychology, how it came about, and why we have so many theoretical perspectives or viewpoints. So I have shared this in your resources, so take a look at that. And if you have any questions, let me know. Now, some of the trends that came out of this, now we've looked at the history, but now we have clinical psychology, which is all about that therapy, and then basic and applied methods. We have in 1960 is when the cognitive psychology moved into the behaviorism, which we kind of talked about. Technology allowed us to have neuroscience. So wow, the biology of the brain, everything that you're learning today, that's because of technology. So IT people who are in this class, a huge component to psychology. And then positive psychology. Unusually effective life. Okay, positive psychology teaches you how to have an effective life, have a good life, and it is a growing field. And then, of course, we have the health psychology, which focuses on stress and the physical effects of stress. And then you heard of the sports psychology as well. So, to wrap it up, why is psychology marked by such diversity in their theories? Why do we have so many competing views? I mean, why does psychology? You can kind of see, we kind of talked about it, and you can see a little bit about it, but really one reason is that no single theory can adequately explain everything that we know about behavior. What human beings are very complicated. Sometimes different theories focus on different aspects of behavior. Sometimes there is simply more than one way to look at something. Is the glass half empty or half full? Obviously, it is both. To take an example from another science, physicists wrestled for years with the natural light. Is it a wave or is it a particle? In the end, it proved useful to think of light sometimes as a wave and sometimes as a particle. Similarly, if a business executive lashes out at her employees with stringent criticism, is she releasing pent-up aggression urges, which is that psychoanalytic view? Or is she making a habitual response to stimulus of incompetent workers, which is a behavioral view? Is she trying to act like a tough boss because that's a key aspect of her own self-concept, which is that humanistic view? Or is she exhibiting an inherited tendency to be aggressive, a biological view? In some cases, all four of these explanations might have some validity. In short, it is an oversimplification to expect that one view has to be right while all others are right. So that's the key to all of this. Life is rarely that simple. In view of complexity of behavior, it would be surprising if there were not a number of different theories. I mean, we can't just rely on one. It's probably best to think of the various theoretical orientations in psychology as complementary viewpoints, each with its own advantage and limitations. They got both. Don't lean too much to one. And I actually did that when it came to nature nurture. Indeed, modern psychologists increasingly recognize that theoretical diversity is a strength rather than a weakness. Okay. And I apologize for my grouchy dog back there. So sometimes different theories focus on those different aspects of behavior, and sometimes there is simply more than one way to look at something. Again, is the glass half empty or half full? Obviously, it's both. Okay, thank you for joining. And if you have any questions, please, please, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. I am here to help you. You want to go into more in-depth conversation about it, we can do that any Saturday, or, you know, schedule time with me if you can't meet me on Saturday. So have a wonderful rest of your first week, and we will jump into week 2 Monday.